All right, and we're live. All right, we'll give everybody a minute or two to join since we just started. I'll go ahead and actually introduce and say welcome. Welcome to the live stream. Today I'm joined by Fabian, and we're going to talk about DevPod. So Fabian spent the last couple months, I say months, not how many months?
Well, it's like 3.5 months, I guess. Yeah.
3.5 months from like, oh, I can start working on this to last week, right? Okay. So the last couple months working on the project, and he'll be showing us a demo on how to use it, and then we can answer any questions or anything that comes up too. Let me make sure I'm watching the questions. But yeah, today's gonna be a demo. Let me go and hand it over to Fabian and let him talk about the last couple of months, like why he's excited about DevPod and the crazy excitement that's been around it in the last like week. It's been awesome.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mike. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. And yeah, finally having DevPod out, which is our new open source project here at Loft Labs, which is targeted once again at the developer community. If you kind of know already a little bit what Loft Labs is doing, we already have other projects that target the developer space, like vCluster or DevSpace already. But kind of the new thing which we saw, which is also why we launched DevPod, is that we wanted to create a project that is essentially able to reuse the dev container JSON, which is like a schema or like a methodology invented at Microsoft to spin up developer environments, which they use for GitHub Codespaces and also for their VS Code extension. And we thought this is a really great schema to use. And we thought, hey, why can we not make this essentially available for every backend, open source, and especially client only, which gives you easy way to spin up your developer environment everywhere. And the key thing about the dev containers in general is, like the name suggests, that these environments are spinned up as a container. And
I have a question for you. How does that work? So the dev container, you put that in your GitHub repository, and then you can like launch off of that too. So like you're actually adding it to your GitHub repository, and you can define how things should be set up for others if they want to use it too, or
exactly. Yeah. So the idea is that you kind of define what you need to develop a certain project. So let's say you have like a Node.js application, you would need obviously Node.js. And Docker files are great for essentially defining dependencies that are required for an application. And the idea behind dev containers is to kind of reuse these Docker files to not only specify what the application needs, but also what the developer environment needs in terms of tooling, in terms of dependencies, and in terms of configuration. So the idea basically is that every repository has its own dev container JSON that is used to spin up the environment of the project.
So you can kind of customize, and each project can have something a little bit different. That's awesome. Can you customize too to where like I can define VS Code themes or anything like that, or that's a little bit beyond? Like that's just going to be based on what I'm using.
You can also define VS Code settings and VS Code extensions. So you can really say, hey, I need that extension for this project. I need that setting for this project. So it's very, very customizable and very, very flexible. And this makes it also so powerful because you can say really what do you need for this project to develop on, and then DevPod or GitHub Codespaces spins up that environment according to your specification, and you have everything you need to start developing.
So you can define your development requirements instead of putting it on a page and having somebody go through and like set everything up, so they can just immediately start if you wanted to. Like that's your pages here, just use our dev container and get started.
Exactly. That's the idea. Yeah.
So we have a question real quick too. Say, as the dev environment is a container image, when you install an extension, it persists. How would you handle, or it does persist? How would you handle that when you need to tailor to developer needs? Okay, it does not persist. Sorry, Sam. So when you install an extension, it doesn't persist. How would you handle that when you need to tailor to developer needs?
I'm not sure if I understand correctly. Like the cool thing about dev containers is also that they actually persist data as long as the container is running or stopped. You can also stop the container, but that doesn't mean the state is erased, so the state is persisted. If the kind of an extension has a state, what's also possible is to have some sort of like dot files that can like customize your developer environment for a specific developer beyond what the dev container JSON is actually doing. And within the dev container JSON, you can also specify like scripts that should run in the beginning to like populate certain data or populate certain extension data that might be required for development.
That makes sense. Yeah, I'm not sure if the question's like, does it not persist within VS Code or in the container?
It should be like, okay, maybe that's something we should stress out, is that like VS Code itself is running inside the container. So the idea is really that your like client locally like is really like a thin client. So you only have VS Code as a screen there, but the actual VS Code instance is running inside the container, and all the state of VS Code is also saved inside the container. So every change you do inside the IDE is actually persisted inside the container.
Gotcha. All right, well, awesome. Should we go ahead and move over to a demo and show off what the new UI and everything looks like?
Yes.
What version are we on now?
Oh, it's 0.15. So we, awesome. Since the launch last Tuesday, we had a couple of smaller issues on different platforms, which are now mostly solved, and now every platform is running smoothly. So yeah, with that, let me present entire screen.
Maybe I'll ask some of the questions too while you're demoing to break it up a little bit. All right,
All right, and here we are. This is the desktop application. So the desktop application is essentially also building upon the DevPod CLI, which you can also easily install through the desktop application, can add that automatically to your path. And with the CLI, you can also completely configure and manage all your developer environments. Yeah, with that, let's jump in and create such an environment. So, I already have a Kubernetes provider. Let's start from scratch again. And essentially, like I said earlier, the cool thing about DevPod is we don't really care what the backend is. The backend is kind of defined through a so-called DevPod provider. And this DevPod provider can be either targeting like a local computer. So for example, if I select the Docker provider here, this is targeting my local Docker desktop that is running here. I can also use a Kubernetes provider that is targeting any Kubernetes context I have configured locally. Or I can also target like a regular SSH configuration, and that is like a really cool thing that DevPod can do. You can actually start a cloud virtual machine and use that virtual machine to spin up the dev container. And this also allows you to kind of have extra resources, for example, like GPUs that you might require for developing, or any other, service that is not available locally that you can do. And you can even add your own custom providers and writing providers. We have like an example page in our docs there. Is pretty easy. You can just select them or like specify GitHub repository. DevPod will download them and then essentially add this provider to the list here, and you can select it to spin up your workspaces.
I already saw a question about like libvirt and doing local stuff and everything. People are kind of excited about, I have a server down in my basement. Let me go ahead and connect to that.
Yeah, definitely. You can do libvirt. You can spin up like a virtual box, whatever. It can all be automated. Like for example, if we use the Kubernetes provider, we could also like think about a provider that spins up a K3s locally and then targets that. So there's like really, that is also really the goal for DevPod, to kind of provide an interface in terms of like providers that you can implement. And then the developer experience itself is always the same, no matter what provider you use. So let's start with the most easiest provider, the Docker one. we add that locally, and then we have here the option to select any IDE that is supported. So right now, VS Code, VS Code browser, and we have like different JetBrains IDEs that are supported. Can also select none, which will just configure SSH, and then I could use like any IDE that is not listed here that supports SSH connections. For now, I will do VS Code because it's the easiest. And I can paste in any GitHub URL here. I can also select quick start here, which is essentially just the VS Code Microsoft quick start for dev containers. So we didn't do any specific quick starts because we could just reuse those since DevPod supports dev container JSON, which is also the schema used by Microsoft for their Codespaces. So let's try the Go one.
If I click stop sharing at the bottom, or hit hide, sorry, at the very bottom, to the right.
Sorry, yeah.
No problem.
Right. And
so I got a question for you. So when you're using this, what are you doing more often? Are you in Goland or are you VS Code?
Yeah, I personally usually use Goland because I'm a JetBrains fanboy, and I really like the Goland IDE. Although I really like VS Code with the Golang extension as well. Yeah. So I think both are very good options. Browser-based development is also possible if you don't want to install any IDE locally. But yeah, if you want to use JetBrains IDEs, this is possible through their JetBrains gateway, which essentially tunnels the connection to the remote workspace. All right, so let's start this. We have a Docker provider, we have VS Code, and we have Golang. What this is doing is actually it's calling the DevPod CLI in the background and is essentially forwarding the logs of the CLI output. So essentially you can also just write DevPod up and then GitHub, Microsoft, and then VS Code example Go, and this would yield the exact same output than what is shown here. So this really shows the desktop is just kind of like a wrapper for the CLI to make it easier and to not like have you remember all the different commands there. And what has happened is essentially a container got started, and DevPod has installed a small daemon into the container, which tunnels or a small agent, which tunnels the SSH connection from our local computer into the container. And the container is also running locally. So if I check via Docker, I need to my password.
Trying to do DevPod up.
Sorry, that was the wrong command. Shows this is the command, the container that is actually started by DevPod, which is hosting the workspace this time. So we can use also DevPod to develop locally. It's not needed to have like a cloud provider or anything configured. And this is also the cool thing about DevPod. It doesn't matter where the backend is. Can be locally, can be anywhere, but the kind of the developer experience is always the same. It will start VS Code. It always shows an SSH connection here, and it will behave the exact same way no matter what provider you choose.
So will a Docker container go to sleep with a Docker provider, or all the providers have a sleep function?
Yes, all providers have a sleep function. The Docker provider, though, doesn't have it as a default. Okay. However, you can configure it under advanced options in the inactivity timeout. So I could say like 10 minutes here, and then it would stop the container automatically after 10 minutes if it's unused. So this is definitely also a possibility for the Docker provider. So for cloud providers, it will not only stop the container, but it will also stop the complete virtual machine. And the idea behind this is obviously to save costs, because you are not always working in the workspace. So when you're not working, the idea is to shut down the virtual machine, like GitHub Codespaces is doing with the Codespace to save cloud costs essentially. And for Docker or Kubernetes, it will stop the container and essentially save computing resources with that.
Since there's a command line tool and all that stuff, you could just come in to work in the morning and then just say like DevPod up and then get all the stuff running that you want to use in the morning because it's shut down at night.
Yeah, exactly. And DevPod will automatically see, oh, this was shut down. It will spin up again the virtual machine, or it will start the container. And for example, locally, you don't really notice any difference, even though the container stopped. So for example, maybe we can do that now. We can stop the container here. We'll see, oh, this is, we cannot reconnect. If we reload the thing here, we are back in there, and it seems like, hey, it's just back. Although in the background, DevPod has restarted the container. So
my question is, how would you integrate it with dev.sh for spinning the environment up? Or are there any integrations?
You mean, or dev.sh?
Dev.sh.
I'm not sure like what dev.sh.
Okay.
Maybe it's dev.env.sh. But for example, like it's very similar to how you would do it with Codespaces. So you could have an install or like a script. So for example, here's the dev container JSON, which essentially defines the environment. And here you could have like a post create command that spins up Nix. And then you can have in the settings, in the VS Code settings, can define that as your default shell. And then you have all the stuff that is needed configured in there. So this is really similar to how Codespaces, or exactly the same actually, on how Codespaces is recommending to use Nix with dev container JSON.
So here's a question for your forks repository. Do you have your own dev container that you don't sync with the main repository, like for your own configuration settings? Like, do you do anything special or anything with Golang? Or you could, right? Like you could do something special if you don't want to use the main repository's dev container.json.
You mean like if you want to customize this just for your local use case?
Yeah.
You can. I mean, you can. So right now we don't have this in the desktop, but in the CLI we have a flag called dev container path. So you can essentially override the dev container JSON with your custom configuration. We also plan on allowing this to be actually outside of the project. So right now it has to be relative to the project, but we actually also want to allow this to be outside of the project, which means you can have your own dev container JSON somewhere on your local computer and use that to essentially spin up an environment in Google Cloud. But yeah, right now it has to be relative to the project at least. I mean, obviously you can also just put it in here and then use that flag to say like, hey, it's at that location. But eventually we want to make it also possible to load it from the local computer.
These are just personal questions for me that I'm interested in.
No, we had that question before, that people want to customize this, that you want to exchange the image, for example, with the personalized image. So these are very valid questions. And in future, we also plan to support dot files, which is right now not supported yet. But dot files also allow you to inject custom configuration into the dev container, which is not defined in the repository itself. So for example, like your personal aliases or bash scripts or modifications to the environment that you need would get cloned into the container and then be available there as well.
It's probably a lot more helpful too for like browser-based VS Code.
Yeah. But also here it makes sense because it's nice. All right, so let's start real quick the server here, which is now listening on port 9000. We see already this was forwarded by VS Code, and now we can go to localhost here. 9,000. And we see the hello, which is actually correct. Looks a little bit odd though, which is not our fault, but it's here. So if you would say hello world, save that, you need to rerun it and for this example, and then you would see hello world here. Awesome. Which is pretty cool because this is now running inside a container, but seems like it would running on the local host. So the experience is very similar. All right, so let's...
Okay, we have another question. Submit DevSpace. How would you integrate this with DevSpace?
That's a good question. So essentially what DevPod is doing, it provides you the environment for where the IDE itself is running on. But DevSpace would be usually, for example, we do that for vCluster, then installed within the Codespace. So you would say, I use an image or I configure a Docker file that installs DevSpace. And then within my workspace here, I can then use DevSpace to actually start the application. Because DevSpace is kind of the tooling to start your application, while DevPod is the tooling to start your IDE for a project. But within that IDE, you still have to start your application, right? And DevSpace is the tool to start the actual application then. So DevPod comes kind of before DevSpace.
I think that's the disconnect too, right? With DevSpace, you're launching the application, which means you can have other things in Kubernetes around it, like Ingress and stuff like that. But DevPod, exactly. Ingress doesn't matter because it's not really running; it's just port forwarding, and you're not running the application.
Exactly. And it would run the application inside the Kubernetes container, and then essentially use that to execute everything. And maybe another difference between DevPod and DevSpace is there is no code sync here. So if I change something in the server.go, it will stay as a change in that container, while with DevSpace, the change would get synced down to your local computer and the change would there. So DevPod really expects you to work inside this IDE here. Which is also why we forward, for example, certain credentials into the container. So your Git credentials are available here. So if I check, for example, my username in here, it shows my name, even though I'm in a Docker container. And that is because DevPod is configuring Git already to have like a credentials helper to target the local host, so we don't have to set up Git every time again. And the same goes for Docker, for example. So if I have like a workspace with Docker, Docker is already configured in there to target the registries I have permissions to, which is an interesting feature we have.
So like with this, you're still testing, like you still need to make a commit and get it merged in, and then from there you would deploy your app. Whereas like DevSpace, just kind of
exactly. So like the developer flow itself doesn't really change. You would just say like, hey, I spin up my workspace here, then the IDE opens up, and you start developing. All right, so let's try something else. Let's try actually a Google Cloud virtual machine. Which is a little bit cooler than local Docker. So I have selected Europe West here because I'm based in Europe. There's an interesting feature below here, which essentially says we want to reuse a single virtual machine for all our workspaces. I can also untoggle this, which means DevPod will spin up one virtual machine per workspace. For now, I will say we want just one virtual machine for all our workspaces. And now if I create the same thing, this time I'll open Goland because I like Goland for my personal development. And I have selected the G-Cloud provider here, so not Docker this time. And I create the workspace this time. What will happen is DevPod will first create a virtual machine within Google Cloud and then set up that machine to have Docker installed, to essentially have the provider installed, and we'll also install like a small DevPod daemon to kind of like track the status on when someone is connected to a workspace or not, to like figure out automatically, hey, this virtual machine now needs to be shut down, for example. And then it starts. So here it starts already pulling the image that we need for our development. And so Docker was installed already. And now it downloads Golang into the virtual machine. It extracts Golang, and then it will open up the JetBrains gateway to target that virtual machine within Google Clouds. All right, and now it's essentially done. JetBrains gateway has opened. It's preparing everything, which usually takes like 10 seconds or something like that. It will start a remote IDE backend and then open up Golang within that virtual machine, and within that virtual machine, the container. So if we are,
as part, I guess is the gateway like a paid version of Golang, like that's part of like the paid service.
Yeah, Golang in general is paid. So there's no, I think there's a free trial version, but there is no actual free version at all. But yeah, JetBrains Gateway is like it's you don't have to pay anything extra for that. It's just like a separate application that kind of connects your local computer to these remote IDEs, I would say. And yeah, we use that within DevPod to essentially connect the local computer to the remote IDE as well, and configure everything automatically so you don't have to. And now we have opened that within Google Cloud. So this shows we have disk, we have so if I go CPU info, I'll see this is a server CPU at 3.1 gigahertz, and which is definitely more than what I have locally on my Mac. And yeah, I can now use this machine to actually start developing. So I will do the same thing as I did locally. I will start the server.go. I'll forward the port 9000. And then I can run this, and we'll see we have to change, or can change, this part again.
So it's interesting in case like you're not running Kubernetes or anything with like containers remotely, and you're just doing like virtual machines. Like that's what.
Yeah, this is a virtual machine. There's no Kubernetes involved at all. So this is pure Google Cloud, pure containers. There is no Kubernetes involved yet. So Kubernetes will be the next provider I will show, but for now, this is solely a virtual machine that was spin up for our workspace. And that's it. We install Docker inside, we spin up the container according to the dev container JSON, which was defined here again, and that's it. But there is no Kubernetes anywhere here.
And the benefits here is that you have like maybe a faster machine, so your tests are going faster. Anything else
exactly.
you run is going to run faster.
For example, GPU have in the year like test machine learning, AI things. You can, if you really need the power, for example, for Docker builds, it's very useful. Or even if you just don't want to run something locally and test something on a remote machine, this is a really, really good use case for that.
The container being a good thing too, to where you don't have to install the stuff locally on your machine for all the requirements and all that.
If I don't want to install Golang locally, or if I need a specific version like 1.19, for example, or I don't know, 1.16 or so, I don't want to delete that my Golang installation locally. I would install it here. and then try out something here and then get rid of the environment later.
So you're saying like you could use a single virtual machine too for multiple workspaces if you don't want to launch a single one, which that's actually pretty cool. I didn't know that was one of the features. I thought it would
exactly
be one-to-one.
Yeah, so for example, we can try that out. So all right, so we are done for now with that workspace. So it's not shown yet here inside the desktop application, but DevPod actually sorry, it's called list has like a concept called machine, which in this case shows you the actual Google Cloud machine that was created. So what I can also do is I can say like, hey, I want to log into that machine. And now I'm inside the Google Cloud virtual machine. So this is now running essentially an SSH command within the Google Cloud machine that was created by DevPod. And we'll also see, hey, there is Docker running. We can even take a look at the container that was spawned as earlier or as shown earlier locally. And like with the CLI, it makes, so for example, you want to spin up, I don't know, another project, let's say my org, my user, or my project. And then you could target that machine here as well. So you would say like DevPod shared gcloud, right? But DevPod supports an option for that, which does that automatically, which was the one I showed earlier, this reuse machine option here. And that essentially means like every new workspace that we start now. So let's say I want to develop something in Python, this time in VS Code.
So a question before you move on. Is there an option to name the VM so all of the platform people aren't afraid? Or is that something coming maybe in the future, like to where you can
you can also name you can also name the machine. So
there's a bunch of like my DevPod VMs like
people
are like
you can also name the machine whatever you would like.
Awesome.
There's an option for that. But if you don't specify an option, it will be called like it was shown here.
DevPod shared.
DevPod shared gcloud. And yeah, since we now start another workspace, it will show reuse existing machine for workspace, which means this startup is like a lot quicker now than it was before, because it doesn't need to start or create a new machine, and instead will reuse the existing machine to essentially create this workspace on. You could also create a different machine, obviously, if you want. It will also install some basic commands there as defined in the dev container JSON. And now we are again in VS Code inside Google Cloud again in a different project though. And we will also see Go, for example, is not installed here. So only the tooling that we need to develop this project, which in this case is Python, will be or is used. So let's start this.
Sorry, a question for you. We're doing this too. So say I'm an enterprise and I have my own provider I want to create. You said you can just import a provider by pointing to a GitHub repository. So like I could write my own provider. Maybe it's not shared with everybody, obviously. It's not in DevPod, but I could write my own thing for my own platform team and then have information that my users need to put in. And I could, if it's an internal repository, I could assume information maybe or pull information from somewhere else. They don't have to put in their keys or something like that.
Exactly. So yeah, the provider specification essentially is pretty open. So you can, it's essentially like what DevPod is doing is it's just calling a command and then tunneling all connections through a single command. So for example, for Docker, it's just Docker exec. Or for Google Cloud, it's just like a SSH connection. And as soon as you can somehow point or like essentially execute a command on a remote machine somehow, wherever that is located, you can write a provider for that, which is usually So for example, for just like fun, we wrote a provider that is actually launching a workspace in a GitHub action. So you can use a GitHub action to develop your project in. Obviously, this doesn't really make sense because like actions are built by the minute, but that would still be possible. And for example, for providers such as DigitalOcean or Civo, you would enter like a token, and you can write your own provider to like whatever backend, and like enter a token here. You could also like call an underlying CLI that is
so like username and password or something like that if it's like internal, and it could like check.
Yeah. So for example, for the G-Cloud provider, it was just reusing the credentials I have locally. So I have my G-Cloud command configured here, and that essentially is already configured with credentials. So the G-Cloud provider is reusing those credentials to create the VM. Same goes for the AWS or Azure provider. And you can always set up something similar for whatever backend you have. You can also ask the user if that's not possible, like user password here, and then add provider. And then the provider, there's an option to essentially verify these things and then print a message to the user if that's not the correct username or password. So yeah, providers are pretty flexible, and we will also add more options to that to make it even easier and even more powerful. But yeah, I think for now you can almost cover every cloud, every regular backend that you have. We even made a Terraform provider, so you can use Terraform to spin up your backend. That is also possible.
It's like one of the main focuses too, right? Like make an easy developer environment, let you run it anywhere.
Exactly. So like I said earlier, what our goal really is with DevPod is to provide this kind of interface. So the developer experience is really easy. You can just select like the backend here, and then everything else essentially always behaves the same. You have like these different IDEs you can use. You can open it through here. You can stop it, delete it. You can connect to it with SSH, and everything happens automatically as long as the provider is configured correctly.
We gotta give props to Pascal too. The UI looks pretty cool. What's coming next? Dark mode? We got dark mode in the near future, or?
Yeah, dark mode is definitely on the roadmap. Unfortunately, we couldn't get it in for the initial launch, but yeah, I think we'll definitely add that soonish. Yeah, we'll probably also work on adding a more generic way to specify IDEs. So right now, this is more or less hard-coded here, but we got a lot of feedback already for other IDEs. So for example, VS Code browser right now is open VS Code, but people want to have like the actual VS Code because of Copilot or other special extensions. There's other people who want Vim integrate or like a direct Vim integration or even other IDEs. So I think we will eventually also add a way for you to define your custom IDE. And then there are other things, like I said earlier, like for example, dot files or yeah, having the dev container path option in the CLI a little bit more flexible, so you can define your custom dev container JSONs.
Say, a benefit of open source, right? Like you can't be like, hey, just use VS Code. Like if someone wants to use Emacs or something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll build something for it and I can do it myself. All right.
Yeah. And yeah, now next and last thing I want to show is actually the Kubernetes provider, real quick, just to show this is also possible, because that is a very useful provider, because you can now also launch your workspace.
So I have a question too on the workspaces. So when you have one of these, if you go down, what's the pre-build repository for?
Oh, yeah. So we didn't need that so far because because right now, or for the workspaces I showed, there was already a packaged image, right? And which is defined here. But what you can also do is you can define here build, and then you can define a Docker file in here. And essentially, with that Docker file, you can specify how DevPod should build a repository. And depending on that or dev environment, sorry. And depending on that Docker file, essentially the workspace is built, but this Docker file can be pretty huge and this build could take pretty long. So what we've built in there is a pre-built repository. So you could say like, I don't know, we have Loft.sh and then pre-builds. And then you can also define it actually in the dev container JSON. So you can say, for example, DevPod here, and then pre-built repositories. And then you can, I don't know, the GitHub registry, Loft.sh, pre-builds. And then what will happen is DevPod will check this repository before actually building the image here, if there is already a pre-built available, which saves you essentially time on spinning up developer environments.
Yeah, some things could take a little bit of time, like a couple minutes if it's got a lot of stuff in there. Like vCluster takes a little bit to get going.
Exactly. So vCluster, for example, we have things like a kind in there, which needs to be installed. We have other things like DevSpace that needs to be downloaded and installed. And this all takes time. And obviously, if you just define an image, it's much faster, but you don't always want to define an image because you want to have the kind of Docker file really close to the actual configuration. And with this pre-built repository, you are essentially able to define a repository where DevPod will look for pre-builds. And there is a command to actually create pre-builds for the CLI. It's called DevPod build. And then you can do like, I don't know, the repository, and then you say this should be pushed to Loft.sh pre-builds.
Okay.
And then it will use the current provider to spin up a workspace for this repository and push it to this Docker repository.
Awesome.
And then you can enter this in here, and next time you save the building time essentially on spinning up the workspace. All right, let's quickly start Kubernetes. What didn't we have here? So let's start it in the browser this time. All right, and what we will see this time is DevPod will create a persistent volume in the Kubernetes cluster I'm connected to. It will create a pod. It waits for the pod, obviously, to come up. And then it opens up VS Code, this time in the browser, inside the Kubernetes pod. And when we take a look now here at the Kubernetes cluster, which is just my local Docker desktop Kubernetes cluster, we'll see there was a pod spun up, which is this one, which essentially holds our developer environment this time. So DevPod is also able, besides spinning up environments in Google Cloud, in Docker, also in Kubernetes, which is pretty cool because Kubernetes is kind of the abstraction layer for infrastructures, which also works everywhere. It's cloud agnostic, and you can just use Kubernetes as a provider to spin up your developer environments as well. And
are you developing on an iPad yet?
Not yet, but we are on it. All right, and with that,
that's perfect. I'll say thank you for the demo. I think we at least touched on some stuff that we haven't shown in some of the other demos or even really talked about as much. So hopefully that explains some of the things to people if they had questions. A lot of it's in the docs too. You can read the docs, and if you have additions you want to make the docs open source, you can add it in there too. If you add a provider and you want to document it and stuff like that. Well, I guess, are we taking in providers other people have written or immediately? Are we going to make a different repository for it? Are we going to, because eventually we have this little drop down menu, right? Of just so many providers.
Yeah, and we'll see. We'll definitely find a way to integrate community providers in there. We're still debating right now what's the best approach. But yeah, we'll maybe do a registry, provider registry, like Terraform is doing, or something else. We are not sure yet. But yeah, we definitely want to integrate as many community providers as possible. We want to encourage everyone to write their own providers. If there are problems or things missing that are right now not possible with the current provider API, essentially, we want to definitely expand the possibilities there and make sure you can integrate really every backend that is somehow able to run containers into DevPod.
All right, so what, devpod.sh or GitHub, Loft, DevPod. Devpod.sh will give you all the links you need to go to. So yeah, thanks again for the demo. Anything else you want to add? Excited about DevPod? Great first week.
Yeah, we had a very good week. Was really cool to see so much engagement and people. Like we have a couple of community providers already, so much ideas that were really great. So yeah, right now we are pretty overwhelmed with kind of working through all these issues, but I hope we'll eventually make it. If you're interested in contributing to DevPod itself, yeah, definitely go for it. As I said, there's a lot of open issues right now we are working on, or you could work on. And yeah, we want to really build a community around this because we think dev containers are great. And yeah, want to make sure these dev containers can be run everywhere.
Okay, so join our community too, slack.loft.sh, and there's a DevPod channel in there if you have questions. We get a lot of questions trying to answer them all, but yeah, like there's a lot of work going into fixing things and then answering questions and stuff too. And we're a small team, so any help would be awesome too. Yeah, if you want to fix something on your own. But all right, let me do a little outro and say thank you for joining us. Like I said, if you're interested in trying out yourself, head over to devpod.sh, join our community, and we'll see you next time. We should have some more live streams coming up about some of the other stuff that we make too. All right, thank you so much, Fabian.
Thank you.
All right, bye everyone.